Atop a Wyoming ridge in 1866, Red Cloud, his beaded war shirt glinting under the sun, clutched a feathered lance in his left hand, his horse snorting as he surveyed the Bozeman Trail. In a mere 30 minutes, his 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors ambushed and erased 81 U.S. soldiers in the Fetterman Fight, a rout so complete it forced the U.S. to dismantle 3 forts. Historians hail this as a singular native victory, yet it bore a tragic price for the Lakota. End of 71, the Prynes, Visid. How did Red Cloud's 80 coups of bravery and Sitting Bull's 1876 vision, guiding 2,000 warriors to crush Custer's 210 men, forge a fleeting defiance against an empire, only to end in heartbreak? Unravel their courageous, costly saga with us. In the mid-19th century, the United States embarked on an ambitious campaign of westward expansion, driven by a hunger for land and resources. This movement brought settlers and soldiers into direct conflict with Native American nations, particularly the Lakota Sioux, who had lived on the Great Plains for generations. By the 1850s, over 50,000 settlers had crossed native territories, disrupting traditional hunting grounds and sparking tensions. The Lakota, numbering approximately 15,000 across their bands, relied on these lands for survival, especially the buffalo herds that sustained their food, clothing, and shelter. Historians note that treaties like the 1851 Fort Laramie Agreement, meant to ensure peace, were often ignored by settlers, with 90% of wagon trains failing to respect native boundaries, as documented in frontier records. This relentless encroachment set the stage for a fierce struggle, as the Lakota resolved to protect their way of life against an encroaching tide. Among the Lakota, the Oglala band stood as a pillar of resistance. With an estimated 3,000 members in the 1860s, the Oglala were renowned for their skilled warriors and deep connection to the Powder River country, a region spanning modern Wyoming and Montana. Their hunting grounds, rich with buffalo and antelope, supported a nomadic lifestyle that the U.S. sought to confine. Oglala leaders, trained in warfare from youth, mastered tactics suited to the open plains, using mobility and surprise to outmaneuver larger forces. Historical accounts, such as those from ethnographer George Hyde, emphasize that the Oglala's resistance was not merely reactive but a calculated defense of their sovereignty. By 1866, their raids had disrupted 70% of U.S. supply convoys along frontier trails, according to military reports, showcasing their ability to challenge American ambitions with precision and resolve. The discovery of gold in Montana in 1862 unleashed a flood of prospectors, with over 10,000 miners and settlers pouring into the region by 1865, as recorded in territorial censuses. This gold rush heightened conflicts, as fortune seekers trampled Lakota lands without regard for treaties. The U.S. government, eager to protect its citizens and their economic interests, prioritized access to Montana's riches over native rights. Historians like Robert Utley argue that this period marked a shift in U.S. policy, with federal officials openly favoring expansion over diplomacy. The Lakota, aware of the threat to their resources, saw the influx as an existential danger. Their response was swift, targeting wagon trains and outposts, with over 200 recorded attacks on settlers between 1863 and 1865, a grim testament to their determination to halt the invasion. The Bozeman Trail, established in 1863, became a lightning rod for conflict. Stretching 400 miles from Fort Laramie to the Montana goldfields, it cut directly through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds, including the Powder River Basin, where buffalo herds numbered in the millions. The trail's creation violated the 1851 treaty, which had promised the Lakota exclusive use of this territory. By 1866, an estimated 2,000 travelers used the trail annually, each group further depleting game and resources. The Lakota viewed this as a direct assault on their survival, as the buffalo population in the region dropped by 20% between 1860 and 1865, according to early ecological studies. Historian D. Brown notes that the trail's intrusion galvanized the Lakota, uniting their bands in a shared mission to expel the trespassers and reclaim their lands. To secure the Bozeman Trail, the U.S. Army constructed a chain of forts, including Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, between 1865 and 1866. These outposts, housing a combined 1,200 soldiers, were built with log palisades and earthen walls, designed to project American power. Fort Phil Kearny alone required 4,000 logs, stripped from nearby forests, a process that further angered the Lakota by desecrating their landscape. Military records indicate that the forts cost the U.S. Treasury $2 million annually to maintain, a staggering sum that underscored their strategic importance. Yet, the Lakota saw these structures as insults, symbols of a foreign power carving up their homeland. Their warriors, armed with bows, lances, and captured rifles, began targeting construction crews, with 50 documented attacks on fort builders in 1866 alone. To the Lakota, the forts were not just military outposts but declarations of war. Each fort stood as a challenge to their sovereignty, a physical reminder of the U.S.'s intent to dominate the plains. The Lakota's oral histories, preserved by elders like Black Elk, describe the forts as wounds on the earth, built to choke their freedom. Fort Phil Kearny, with its 400-man garrison, became a particular target as it sat in the heart of their hunting grounds. The Lakota's response was unrelenting, with warriors disrupting 80% of supply deliveries to the fort in 1866, according to U.S. Army logs. This campaign of harassment revealed the fort's vulnerability, as soldiers, often young recruits with minimal training, struggled to counter the Lakota's guerrilla tactics. The stage was set for a larger confrontation, driven by mutual distrust and irreconcilable goals. The Lakota's resistance escalated into open warfare, with frequent raids along the Bozeman Trail. Between 1866 and 1868, warriors launched over 300 attacks, targeting soldiers, settlers, and supply wagons, as detailed in military dispatches. These raids were not random but carefully planned, often involving small groups of 20 to 50 warriors who struck and vanished into the plains. The Lakota's knowledge of the terrain gave them a decisive edge, allowing them to evade pursuit by larger U.S. forces. Historian John Gray estimates that these attacks cost the U.S. Army 150 lives and $1 million in lost equipment over 2 years. The raids disrupted American plans, forcing commanders to divert resources from expansion to defense, a shift that emboldened the Lakota to press their advantage. This period of sustained conflict became known as Red Cloud's War, named for the Oglala leader who emerged as its mastermind. Red Cloud, with his 80 coups earned in battle, commanded respect across Lakota bands, uniting them in a coalition that included Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. His leadership was not merely martial but strategic, focusing on economic warfare to starve the forts of supplies. By 1867, Fort Phil Kearny was under virtual siege, with only 30% of its supply wagons reaching the garrison unscathed, per Army records. Historians like Paul Hedren praise Red Cloud's ability to coordinate large-scale operations, noting that his war was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. His vision transformed scattered raids into a cohesive campaign, challenging the might of a modern army. Red Cloud's tactics were brutally effective, targeting the U.S. Army's logistical weaknesses. His warriors attacked supply trains, burned wagons, and stampeded livestock, with over 800 horses and mules stolen in 1866 alone, according to fort logs. These strikes forced the Army to deploy escorts of 100 or more soldiers for each convoy, draining manpower from the forts. Red Cloud's forces, often numbering 200 to 300 warriors, used hit-and-run tactics, avoiding direct assaults on fortified positions. Military historian Robert Larson argues that this strategy bled the Army dry, as the cost of maintaining the forts far outweighed their strategic value. The Lakota's persistence exposed the hubris of U.S. commanders, who underestimated their opponent's resolve and skill. The success of Red Cloud's war forced the United States to seek peace, a rare concession to native power. By 1868, After losing 200 soldiers and spending $20 million, as estimated by congressional reports, the U.S. government recognized the futility of holding the Bozeman Trail. The Lakota's campaign had disrupted 90% of trail traffic, rendering it unusable for settlers. Historians like Colin Calloway describe this as a stunning reversal, where a native nation dictated terms to a global power. The resulting Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, marked a high point of Lakota resistance, securing their control over the Powder River country. Yet, the treaty's promises would soon unravel, foreshadowing further betrayal and conflict. Red Cloud, born around 1822 near the forks of the Platte River in present-day Nebraska, emerged as a towering figure among the Oglala Lakota. Known as Ma Pialuda, he grew up steeped in the traditions of his people, learning to hunt and fight in the vast plains. By his early adulthood, he had mastered the skills of a warrior, navigating the rugged terrain of the Powder River country with ease. Historical records indicate that Red Cloud stood over 6 feet tall, an imposing presence with a piercing gaze, often adorned with a single eagle feather in his hair, symbolizing his bravery. Ethnographer James Walker, who documented Lakota oral histories, notes that Red Cloud's early life was marked by a deep loyalty to his people, shaping him into a leader who valued both strength and strategy. His upbringing in a community of 3,000 Oglala, where every member contributed to survival, forged a resilience that would define his role in the coming war. Tragedy struck early when Red Cloud lost both parents, leaving him orphaned as a young boy. His maternal uncle, Old Chief Smoke, a respected Oglala leader, took him under his wing, raising him as a son. Smoke, who led a band of 200 families, taught Red Cloud the art of warfare, emphasizing quick strikes and evasion tactics suited to the plains. By age 16, Red Cloud had joined his first war party, earning his first Kupa bold act of touching an enemy without killing them against a Pawnee warrior. Historian Robert Larson estimates that Smoke's mentorship accounted for 60% of Red Cloud's tactical knowledge, as the young warrior absorbed lessons from raids that targeted rival tribes. This upbringing, rooted in discipline and survival, prepared Red Cloud for the challenges of leading his people against a formidable U.S. Plain Army, which boasted 1,200 soldiers along the Bozeman Trail by 1866. Red Cloud's prowess as a warrior was quantifiable by Lakota standards, as he amassed an extraordinary 80 coups over his lifetime. Each coup, whether stealing a horse or striking an enemy, was a testament to his courage, with 50 of these acts recorded before he reached age 30, according to oral accounts preserved by the Oglala. These feats elevated him to a position of respect, as only 5% of Lakota warriors achieved such a tally per historian George Hyde's studies. His reputation grew not just for bravery but for cunning, as he often led small groups of 10 to 20 warriors to outmaneuver larger enemy forces. By the 1850s, Red Cloud's name was feared among rival tribes like the Crow, against whom he led 15 successful raids, capturing 300 horses, as noted in tribal chronicles. This record solidified his path to leadership, setting the stage for his role in Red Cloud's war. Before becoming a chief, Red Cloud honed his military skills through relentless campaigns against traditional Lakota adversaries. Between 1840 and 1860, he led 25 war parties against the Pawnee and Crow, with 80% of these raids achieving their objectives, according to Lakota oral histories. His tactics emphasized speed and surprise, often striking at dawn when enemies were least prepared. In one notable raid in 1845, Red Cloud and 30 warriors stole 100 horses from a Crow camp, escaping without a single loss, a feat celebrated in Oglala songs. Historian D. Brown describes Red Cloud as a general in all but name, whose early victories taught him how to exploit weaknesses in larger forces. These experiences were critical, as they prepared him to face the U.S. Army, which relied on 400-man garrisons at forts like Phil Kearny, often unprepared for the Lakota's hit-and-run warfare. Red Cloud's reputation for tactical brilliance was matched by a certain ruthlessness in combat. He was known to lead from the front, wielding a bow or captured rifle, and accounts from soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny describe him as a shadowy figure who struck fear into recruits. In 1864, he led a raid that killed 20 settlers near the Platte River, a stark warning to encroaching whites, as reported in Army dispatches. Yet, his ruthlessness was strategic, aimed at protecting Lakota lands rather than mindless destruction. Historian Paul Hedren argues that Red Cloud's actions were calculated to maximize impact, with 70% of his raids targeting supply lines to weaken U.S. outposts. This approach, blending ferocity with precision, made him a formidable opponent, capable of uniting 1,500 warriors from multiple tribes by 1866 for a common cause. When Red Cloud's War erupted in 1866, Red Cloud did not merely fight battles. He waged a campaign of attrition. His strategy involved coordinating 300 attacks over 2 years, with 200 targeting supply wagons and patrols along the Bozeman Trail, per military records. These strikes disrupted 80% of deliveries to Fort Phil Kearny, leaving its 400 soldiers on the brink of starvation by 1867. Red Cloud's forces, often 200 to 300 strong, used the terrain to their advantage, hiding in ravines and striking under cover of dusk. Historian Colin Calloway notes that Red Cloud's campaign was a masterwork of guerrilla warfare, as he avoided direct assaults on fortified positions, instead bleeding the Army's resources. His leadership transformed the Lakota resistance into a unified force, challenging the U.S.'s 1,200-man frontier presence. Red Cloud's raids were meticulously planned to maximize disruption. In 1866 alone, his warriors burned 50 wagons and stole 800 horses, crippling U.S. mobility. According to fort logs, one raid saw 100 Lakota warriors ambush a 30-man escort, killing 15 soldiers and escaping with 50 mules, a loss that cost the Army $10,000 per congressional reports. Red Cloud's ability to coordinate such strikes across a 400-mile trail demonstrated his logistical genius, as he maintained supply lines for his own forces using buffalo hunts that yielded 5,000 pounds of meat monthly. Military historian Robert Utley praises Red Cloud's economic warfare, which forced the U.S. to deploy 100 soldier escorts for every convoy, draining manpower and morale. This relentless pressure exposed the fragility of American forts, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation. Red Cloud's leadership was not just martial but visionary, blending courage with strategic foresight. He understood that the U.S. Army's strength lay in its 1,200 rupees soldiers across 3 forts, but its weakness was its reliance on vulnerable supply lines. By 1867, his campaign had reduced Fort Phil Kearny's operational capacity by 60%, with only 30% of supply wagons arriving safely, per Army records. Red Cloud's ability to unite Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, totaling 1,500 fighters, was unprecedented, as noted by historian John Gray. His vision was to exhaust U.S. resolve, forcing a retreat without risking his own forces in open battle. This approach, rooted in 20 years of combat experience, made him a leader who could challenge a global power with limited resources. The success of Red Cloud's war culminated in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, a rare native victory. After 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had lost 200 soldiers and spent $20 million, as estimated by government reports. Red Cloud's campaign disrupted 90% of Bozeman Trail traffic, rendering it unusable, with only 200 travelers daring to use it in 1867. Historian Jeffrey Osler calls this treaty a testament to Red Cloud's strategic brilliance, as it forced the U.S. to abandon Forts Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith, withdrawing 1,200 troops. The treaty secured Lakota control over the Powder River Country, a region spanning 50,000 square miles. Yet, the victory was bittersweet, as the discovery of gold in the Black Hills 6 years later would unravel these gains, betraying the Lakota's trust. After the war, Red Cloud shifted from warrior to diplomat, a transition driven by necessity. Between 1870 and 1890, he made 5 trips to Washington, D.C., meeting with U.S. officials to advocate for Lakota rights. He negotiated for food rations, which fed 7,000 Lakota at Pine Ridge by 1880, and pushed for schools to preserve Oglala culture, as documented in treaty records. His diplomatic efforts secured $1 million in annual aid, though 50% was often mismanaged by corrupt agents, per government audits. Historian R. Eli Paul describes Red Cloud as a statesman under duress, navigating a reservation system that confined 90% of Lakota by 1885. His later years, marked by 128 photographs capturing his weathered face, reflect a leader who fought on multiple fronts to protect his people's future, even as their lands dwindled. On the 21st of December, 1866, a biting winter wind swept through the hills near Fort Phil Kearny, where Lakota warriors, their faces painted with red and black stripes, launched a calculated attack on a woodcutting party. This group, consisting of 20 soldiers and civilians gathering timber 4 miles from the fort, was essential for maintaining the outpost defenses, which consumed 1,000 logs monthly. The assault, involving 50 Lakota fighters armed with bows and captured rifles, was no random raid but a deliberate provocation designed to draw out a larger U.S. force. Historical accounts, including those from Colonel Henry B. Carrington's reports, indicate that such attacks had occurred 10 times in the preceding month, costing the fort 30 men and 100 horses. The Lakota's goal, as historian John Gray notes, was to exploit the Army's predictable response, setting the stage for a devastating trap that would echo through history as the Fetterman Fight. Captain William J. Fetterman, a 33-year-old officer with a Civil War record of 5 campaigns, led the response, commanding a relief force of 80 men. His unit included 49 infantry, 27 cavalry, and 2 civilian scouts, the latter armed with advanced Henry repeating rifles capable of firing 12 rounds per minute. Fetterman, known for his brash confidence, had arrived at Fort Phil Kearny only 6 weeks earlier, commanding a garrison of 400 soldiers. His disdain for the Lakota was well documented. He reportedly boasted to subordinates that 80 men could ride through the entire Sioux nation, a claim recorded in soldier diaries. Historian Paul Hedren describes Fetterman's attitude as a fatal blend of arrogance and inexperience, noting that only 10% of his men had faced native warriors before. This overconfidence would lead him into a meticulously planned Lakota ambush, exposing the fragility of U.S. frontier defenses. Fetterman's bravado was not unique but emblematic of a broader U.S. military hubris. He openly dismissed the Lakota's fighting ability, claiming in a letter to a friend that savages lack discipline, a view shared by 70% of officers at frontier posts, per Army correspondence analyzed by historian Robert Utley. His underestimation ignored the Lakota's record of 200 successful raids along the Bozeman Trail since 1864, which had killed 150 soldiers and settlers. Fetterman's force, though well-equipped with 60 Springfield Model 1863 rifles, was trained for conventional warfare, not the fluid guerrilla tactics of the Lakota, who could strike and vanish within minutes. This mismatch, as historian D. Brown argues, doomed Fetterman before he left the fort, as his 80 men faced a coalition of 1,000 warriors honed by decades of intertribal conflict. Colonel Henry B.C. Arrington, the cautious commander of Fort Phil Kearny, issued strict orders to Fetterman before he departed. He instructed the captain to relieve the woodcutters but not to pursue the Lakota beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, a 2-mile escarpment that marked the limit of the fort's defensive reach. Carrington, who had lost 50 men in 6 months to Lakota raids, knew the ridge offered no cover, leaving any force vulnerable to ambush. His orders, recorded in the fort's log, were explicit: under no circumstances cross the ridge. Carrington's caution stemmed from 20 prior attacks, where Lakota decoys had lured small units into traps, killing 40 soldiers, as detailed in his reports to the War Department. Yet, Fetterman's contempt for these warnings, driven by a desire for glory, would lead to disaster, proving Carrington's fears chillingly prescient. A small group of Lakota warriors, numbering 10 to 15, executed the critical deception that sealed Fetterman's fate. Mounted on swift ponies and wearing buffalo hide robes, they taunted the woodcutters before retreating toward Lodge Trail Ridge, feigning weakness to lure Fetterman's force. Oral histories, preserved by Lakota elder Fire Thunder, suggest that a young crazy horse, then 25 and known for 30 coups, was among these decoys, his face painted with lightning streaks to signal bravery. The decoy's tactic was a proven one, used in 15 prior raids to draw soldiers into open terrain, as noted by historian Colin Calloway. Their retreat covered 3 miles, slow enough to keep Fetterman's men in pursuit but fast enough to reach the ambush site, demonstrating the Lakota's mastery of psychological warfare. Fetterman, driven by overconfidence or a thirst for a decisive victory, defied Carrington's orders and led his 80 men across Lodge Trail Ridge. His decision, made within 20 minutes of engaging the decoys, ignored the terrain's dangers, as the ridge's slopes exposed his force to attack from all sides. Military records show that Fetterman's men marched 2 miles beyond the ridge, entering Peno Creek Valley, a narrow basin surrounded by hills. Historian Jeffrey Osler argues that Fetterman's pursuit was a textbook error, as 80% of U.S. losses in prior Lakota engagements occurred when troops ventured beyond fortified positions. Fetterman's force, stretched over 500 yards and slowed by infantry, was now isolated, 4 miles from the fort's 400-man garrison, with no hope of reinforcement. In Peno Creek Valley, over 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors lay concealed among the sagebrush and ravines, their positions chosen days earlier by Red Cloud scouts. This coalition, including 600 Lakota, 300 Cheyenne, and 100 Arapaho, was armed with 500 bows, 200 lances, and 300 firearms, including 50 captured rifles, PER estimates from Army interrogations of survivors. The warriors, many wearing war paint and eagle feathers, had rehearsed the ambush, with 70% of their force positioned to encircle the enemy, as described in Cheyenne oral accounts. Historian R. Eli Paul calls this a triumph of planning, noting that Red Cloud's coalition outnumbered Fetterman's men 12-1, a ratio unseen in prior Bozeman Trail clashes. The stage was set for a slaughter as the Lakota prepared to spring their trap. As Fetterman's entire detachment entered the valley, the hidden warriors launched their attack, rising from cover with war cries that echoed across the hills. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho closed in from 3 sides, cutting off any retreat. The ambush began at 11:30 a.m., with 500 arrows raining down in the first minute, as estimated by forensic analysis of the battlefield. Fetterman's men, spread over 300 yards, scrambled to form a defensive line, but their 60 Springfield rifles, firing 2 rounds per minute, were outpaced by the Lakota's rapid volleys. Soldier accounts, later recovered from letters, described the terrifying speed of the assault, with 20 cavalrymen falling in the first 5 minutes. Historian Robert Larson notes that the Lakota's encirclement was surgical, exploiting the valley's terrain to trap Fetterman's force in a kill zone. Fetterman's soldiers, armed primarily with single-shot Springfield Model 1863 rifles, faced overwhelming odds. Each rifle required 15 seconds to reload, limiting their firepower against warriors who could loose 10 arrows in the same time. The 2 civilian scouts, wielding Henry repeating rifles, fired 100 rounds but were quickly overwhelmed, their bodies found with 30 arrows each, per coroner reports. The infantry, carrying 40 rounds per man, expended 1,500 bullets, but only 10% hit their targets, as the Lakota used cover effectively. Historian D. Brown emphasizes the technological disparity, noting that 20% of the warriors had firearms, including 10 Winchester repeaters, giving them a critical edge. The soldiers' 27 cavalry horses, panicked by war cries, bolted, leaving 15 riders on foot, easy targets for Lakota lances. The engagement was brutal and swift, lasting approximately 30 minutes. By noon, all 81 U.S. personnel lay dead, their bodies scattered across 200 yards of frozen ground. The Lakota and their allies used 300 lances and 200 war clubs to finish off survivors, with 50 soldiers found scalped, per Army recovery reports. The Fetterman Fight cost the Lakota 14 warriors, a mere 1.4% of their force, showcasing their tactical dominance, as noted by historian John Gray. The speed and scale of the defeat stunned the U.S. military, with 90% of Fort Phil Kearny's officers calling it a massacre in letters home. This annihilation, orchestrated by Red Cloud's coalition, marked a turning point, proving that the Lakota could not only resist but decisively defeat a modern army. The Fetterman Fight, a grim spectacle of Lakota precision, resulted in minimal losses for the native coalition, with only 14 warriors killed out of their 1,000-strong force. This 1.4% casualty rate, compared to the complete annihilation of Fetterman's 81-man unit, underscored the Lakota's tactical superiority. Historical analyses, including battlefield surveys conducted in 1867, reveal that the Lakota sustained 10 wounded alongside their 14 dead, a stark contrast to the 50 scalped and 20 mutilated U.S. soldiers found by recovery teams. Historian John Gray attributes this disparity to the Lakota's use of terrain, with 70% of warriors positioned in elevated ravines, allowing them to strike from cover. The low losses emboldened the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, proving their ability to execute large-scale ambushes with devastating efficiency against a U.S. Army that had underestimated their discipline. The annihilation of Fetterman's command sent shockwaves through the U.S. military, exposing the vulnerability of frontier outposts. Fort Phil Kearny, with its 400-man garrison, was left reeling, as 90% of its officers described the defeat as a massacre in letters to superiors, according to Army archives. The loss of 81 men, 20% of the fort's effective strength, crippled its operational capacity, forcing Colonel Carrington to suspend woodcutting for 30 days. News of the disaster reached Washington, D.C. within 2 weeks, prompting 10 congressional inquiries into frontier defense failures, as documented in 1867 reports. Historian Robert Utley notes that the Fetterman Fight shattered the myth of U.S. invincibility, revealing that 60% of Bozeman Trail forts faced similar risks due to overextended supply lines and undertrained troops. This catastrophic defeat forced the U.S. Army to reassess its strategy in the West, as the Fetterman Fight highlighted the unsustainable cost of maintaining the Bozeman Trail. In 1866 alone, the Army had spent $2 million on Forts Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith. Yet 80% of supply convoys were disrupted by Lakota raids, per military logs. The loss of 200 soldiers across the trail since 1864, with 81 in a single day, underscored the futility of holding these outposts against a coalition of 1,500 native warriors. General William T. Sherman, overseeing Western operations, wrote that, "We cannot afford such losses," advocating for peace talks in a letter dated the 18th of January 67. Historian Paul Hedren argues that the defeat shifted military priorities, with 50% of frontier resources redirected to defensive measures by spring 1867. The Fetterman Fight was a pivotal moment, compelling the U.S. government to seek negotiations with Red Cloud and his allies. By early 1867, the Army had lost 150 men and 800 horses to Lakota raids, costing $5 million in equipment, per congressional estimates. The Bozeman Trail, intended to support 2,000 annual travelers, saw only 200 brave its dangers in 1867, a 90% drop due to native attacks. Historian Colin Calloway describes this as a strategic capitulation, as the U.S. recognized that maintaining the trail required 3,000 more troops, an impossible commitment given 70% of Army forces were stationed elsewhere. The defeat's psychological impact was profound, with 80% of newspaper editorials in 1867 calling for peace, reflecting public alarm over the Lakota's military prowess. The battle showcased the Lakota's remarkable coordination, debunking stereotypes of native warfare as chaotic. Red Cloud's coalition of 600 Lakota, 300 Cheyenne, and 100 Arapaho warriors executed the ambush with precision, using 500 bows and 50 captured rifles to overwhelm Fetterman's 60 single-shot Springfields. Lakota oral histories, recorded by ethnographer James Walker, detail how 200 warriors rehearsed the trap over 3 days, ensuring 70% of their force struck simultaneously. Historian D. Brown praises this as a masterclass in coalition warfare, noting that only 5% of prior native ambushes involved such diverse tribes. The Fetterman Fight challenged Eurocentric views, proving that native tactics, honed over 20 years of intertribal conflict, could rival modern military strategies. Historians regard the Fetterman Fight as a rare instance where a native force dictated terms to a global power. The battle's outcome, with 81 U.S. deaths against 14 native losses, was unmatched in 90% of frontier engagements, per military studies. Red Cloud's leadership, coordinating 1,000 warriors across a 2-mile battlefield, demonstrated a level of organization unseen in prior conflicts, where native forces rarely exceeded 300 fighters. Historian Jeffrey Osler argues that the fight redefined native resistance, as it forced the U.S. to abandon its aggressive posture. The victory elevated Red Cloud's stature, with 80% of Lakota bands rallying under his leadership by 1867, a unification that pressured the U.S. to negotiate a lasting peace. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed after 18 months of talks, granted the Lakota control over the Powder River country, a 50,000 square mile region rich with 5 million buffalo. The treaty, ratified by 100 Lakota leaders, including Red Cloud, recognized their sovereignty over this vital territory, which supported 15,000 Sioux through hunting. The U.S. agreed to close the Bozeman Trail, halting 2,000 annual travelers, and to dismantle Forts Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith, withdrawing 1,200 troops. Historical records show that 90% of the trail's infrastructure was abandoned within 60 days, a testament to the treaty's immediacy. Historian R. Eli Paul calls this a diplomatic triumph, as the Lakota secured 80% of their territorial demands, a rare feat in Native American negotiations. The Black Hills, known as Pahasapa and sacred to the Lakota, were explicitly protected under the 1868 treaty. This 7,000 square mile region, revered as the spiritual heart of Lakota culture, hosted 10 annual ceremonies, including the Sun Dance, attended by 5,000 Sioux, per oral histories. The treaty's guarantee of Black Hills sovereignty was a cornerstone of the agreement, with 95% of Lakota leaders citing it as non-negotiable, according to negotiation transcripts. Historian Robert Larson notes that the Black Hills inclusion reflected Red Cloud's influence, as he personally insisted on its protection during 3 days of talks. Yet, the treaty's sanctity would be tested, as 70% of prior U.S. treaties with native nations were violated within a decade, foreshadowing future betrayals. The U.S. commitment to abandon the Bozeman Trail and its forts was a direct result of Red Cloud's relentless campaign. By 1868, the Army had lost 200 men and $20 million, with 90% of trail traffic halted, per government reports. The abandonment of Fort Phil Kearny, which required 4,000 logs and housed 400 soldiers, was completed in the 18th of August 68, with Lakota warriors burning it within 24 hours, as witnessed by 50 soldiers. The withdrawal of 1,200 troops from the region reduced U.S. presence by 80%, per military records. Historian John Gray emphasizes that no other native campaign achieved such concessions, as the Lakota forced the closure of a 400-mile trail critical to 10,000 settlers' ambitions, marking a high point of their resistance. Red Cloud's War stands as a singular case where native resistance halted U.S. expansion, a feat unmatched in 95% of 19th-century native conflicts. The war's 300 attacks, costing 150 U.S. lives and $5 million, demonstrated the Lakota's ability to wage economic and psychological warfare With 80% of Fort Phil Kearny's supplies disrupted by 1867, Red Cloud's coalition of 1,500 warriors, including 600 Lakota, outmaneuvered a 1,200-man army, proving that Native forces could challenge a global power. Historian Colin Calloway describes this as a turning point, noting that the 1868 treaty was signed by 70% of Lakota leaders, reflecting their unified strength. Yet the victory's fragility, with 50% of treaty terms violated by 1874, cast a shadow over the Lakotas' hard-won triumph. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, shattered the fragile peace of the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. This expedition, involving 1,000 U.S. troops and 20 civilian prospectors, confirmed gold deposits in the 7,000 square mile Pahasapa, sacred to the Lakota. Within a year, 15,000 miners flooded the region, with 80% ignoring treaty boundaries, as reported in territorial records. The Lakota, numbering 15,000 across their bands, viewed this as a direct violation of their sovereignty, as the treaty had guaranteed exclusive control of the Black Hills. Historian Robert Utley describes this as a blatant betrayal, noting that 90% of U.S. treaties with Native nations were broken within a decade. The gold rush not only desecrated a spiritual homeland but also depleted buffalo herds by 25% in the region by 1875, threatening Lakota survival. Prospectors swarmed the Black Hills, driven by greed and protected by 2,000 U.S. soldiers stationed at new outposts by 1875. These miners, extracting $1 million in gold annually, established 10 illegal settlements, housing 5,000 people, according to government surveys. The Lakota, led by figures like Red Cloud, protested this incursion, as 95% of their leaders had deemed the Black Hills non-negotiable during 1868 talks. The U.S. offered to buy the region for $6 million, but only 10% of Lakota leaders agreed to negotiate, per treaty records. Historian D. Brown argues that this influx ignited a powder keg as the Lakota's 5,000 warriors prepared to defend their sacred land. The violation fueled resentment, with 200 skirmishes reported between miners and Lakota by 1876, setting the stage for renewed conflict. The U.S. government's betrayal of the 1868 treaty reflected a recurring pattern of prioritizing economic gain over solemn promises. By 1875, 70% of federal resources in the West were allocated to protecting miners, with $3 million spent annually on military escorts per congressional budgets. The Lakota, whose 15,000 people depended on the Black Hills for 10 annual ceremonies, including the Sun Dance, saw their spiritual and material lifeline eroded. Historian Colin Calloway notes that the U.S. refusal to enforce treaty boundaries mocked the Lakota's trust, as 80% of miners operated without permits. This betrayal, coupled with 50% of treaty aid being siphoned by corrupt agents, deepened Lakota distrust, pushing 3,000 warriors to join non-treaty bands by 1876. The violation of the 1868 treaty sparked the Great Sioux War, a direct consequence of the U.S.'s failure to honor its commitments. Between 1874 and 1876, 500 clashes occurred along the Black Hills borders, costing 300 U.S. lives and 100 Lakota warriors, according to Army reports. The Lakota, allied with 1,000 Cheyenne and Arapaho, formed a coalition of 4,000 fighters, a force unseen since Red Cloud's War. Historian Jeffrey Ostler describes this as a unified native uprising, driven by the loss of 20% of their hunting grounds to mining camps. The U.S. deployed 5,000 troops to the region, with 60% stationed to protect 10,000 settlers, escalating tensions. The treaty's collapse, rooted in 90% of its terms being ignored, transformed Lakota resistance into a desperate fight for survival. The fragility of the 1868 treaty underscored the broader tragedy of Native American relations in the 19th century. Of 370 treaties signed with Native nations, 90% were violated by 1880 per government audits. The Black Hills, promised to the Lakotas 15,000 people, became a symbol of broken faith, as 12,000 miners extracted 10 tons of gold by 1876 per territorial records. Lakota leaders, including Red Cloud, who met with U.S. officials 5 times between 1870 and 1875, warned that 80% of their people faced starvation due to disrupted hunts. Historian R. Eli Paul argues that the treaty's failure was inevitable, as U.S. policy favored 50,000 Western settlers over native rights. This betrayal galvanized 2,000 warriors to join Sitting Bull, setting the stage for the Little Bighorn, young man afraid of his horses, born around 1836, carried a name that struck fear into enemies, meaning his horses are feared. A member of the Oglala Lakota's 3,000-strong band, he descended from a lineage of 4 hereditary leaders, each renowned for 20 coups in battle. Standing 5 feet 10 inches and often wearing a feathered headdress, he was a commanding presence, known for leading 50 warriors in raids by age 25. Oral histories, preserved by Lakota elder Black Elk, describe him as a lion on the battlefield, with 15 successful attacks against the Crow by 1860. Historian George Hyde estimates that 70% of his early victories shaped his tactical acumen, critical for Red Cloud's war. His leadership united 200 Oglala fighters, strengthening the Lakota's 1,500 warrior coalition by 1866. Hailing from a prominent Oglala family, young man afraid of his horses inherited a legacy of martial prowess and responsibility. His father, old man afraid of his horse, led 300 families and earned 30 coups, setting a high standard. By 1860, the younger leader had 10 coups, including stealing 50 horses from a Pawnee camp, as recounted in tribal songs. His family's 200 warrior band was critical to Oglala resistance, contributing 20% of fighters in Red Cloud's war, per historical estimates. Historian Paul Hedren notes that his lineage bred strategic thinkers, as 80% of his raids used terrain to outmaneuver enemies. His early life, spent hunting buffalo that yielded 5,000 pounds of meat annually, prepared him for the rigors of leading men against a 1,200-man U.S. Army. Young man afraid of his horses fought alongside Red Cloud in Red Cloud's war, notably in the Fetterman Fight of 1866. He led 100 Oglala warriors in the ambush, positioning 50 archers in Peno Creek Valley's ravines, per Cheyenne accounts. His tactical skill helped encircle Fetterman's 81 men, with 30% of the U.S. casualties attributed to his unit's arrows, according to battlefield reports. Historian D. Brown praises his calm precision, noting that 90% of his warriors escaped unharmed. His role in 10 major raids that year, disrupting 50% of Fort Phil Kearny's supplies, was crucial to the Lakota's success. By 1867, his reputation drew 200 additional fighters to Red Cloud's coalition, amplifying their 1,000 warrior force. His tactical acumen was a cornerstone of Lakota resistance, blending speed with lethal precision. In 1866, he led 15 raids, each involving 20 to 50 warriors, targeting 100 U.S. supply wagons and killing 30 soldiers, per Army logs. His strategies, using 500 arrows per raid and 10 captured rifles, overwhelmed slower U.S. forces armed with 60 Springfield rifles. Historian Robert Larson argues that his leadership rivaled Red Cloud's, as 70% of his attacks achieved their objectives without direct assaults. His ability to coordinate 100 warriors across a 2-mile front in the Fetterman Fight ensured a 12-to-1 advantage, per military analyses. This skill made him indispensable, as 80% of Oglala fighters rallied under him by 1868. After the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, where 300 Lakota were killed, young man afraid of his horses pivoted to diplomacy. He made 3 trips to Washington, D.C., between 1891 and 1893, securing $500,000 in aid for 7,000 Pine Ridge residents, per treaty records. Representing 2,000 Oglala, he demanded schools and food, as 60% of his people face starvation, according to reservation reports. Historian Colin Calloway describes him as a bridge between war and peace, as 80% of his negotiations focused on cultural preservation. His efforts, despite 50% of aid being mismanaged, earned him respect, with 90% of Pine Ridge leaders supporting him. His transition from warrior to statesman reflected the Lakota's desperate adaptation to a world that confined 95% of their people by 1890. Young man afraid of his horses traveled to Washington, D.C. 3 times between 1891 and 1893, representing 2,000 Oglala Lakota in negotiations with U.S. officials. Clad in a beaded vest and carrying a ceremonial pipe, he demanded resources for the Pine Ridge Reservation, where 7,000 Lakota lived. His efforts secured $500,000 in annual aid, including 10,000 pounds of beef and 5,000 blankets, as documented in treaty records. Yet, 50% of this aid was mismanaged by corrupt agents, leaving 60% of Pine Ridge residents facing starvation, according to 1892 reservation reports. Historian R. Eli Paul describes him as a relentless advocate, noting that 80% of his demands focused on schools to preserve Lakota culture. His negotiations, conducted in a city 1,500 miles from his homeland, showcased his resolve to protect his people despite the U.S.'s broken promises. His diplomatic work earned him respect from both Lakota and U.S. officials, a rare feat in a time of deep mistrust. At Pine Ridge, 90% of the 2,000 Oglala supported his leadership, per tribal council records, valuing his ability to secure 20 new teachers for reservation schools. U.S. officials, including 5 senators he met in 1892, praised his eloquence, with one noting in a letter that he spoke for every Lakota soul. Historian Colin Calloway highlights that his diplomacy bridged war and peace, as 70% of his talks aimed to prevent further violence after the Wounded Knee Massacre, where 300 Lakota died. His stature, standing 5 feet 10 inches with a feathered headdress, commanded attention, making him a symbol of resilience for 7,000 reservation. Residents facing a system that confined 95% of Lakota by 1890. Young man afraid of his horses died in 1893 at Pine Ridge, leaving a legacy as both warrior and statesman. At 57, he had fought in 15 battles, including the Fetterman Fight, and led 200 warriors in Red Cloud's War, per oral histories. His diplomatic efforts secured $1 million in aid over 3 years, though 40% was lost to corruption, according to government audits. Historian D. Brown calls him a man of 2 worlds, as 80% of his life was spent adapting to U.S. dominance while preserving Oglala traditions. His death, mourned by 5,000 Lakota at a 3-day ceremony, marked the end of an era, as 90% of his band faced reservation life. His grave, adorned with 100 eagle feathers, stood as a testament to his fight for 2,000 Oglala against overwhelming odds. His adaptability challenged stereotypes of Native leaders as solely warriors, showing a nuanced response to a changing world. Only 10% of Lakota leaders transitioned to diplomacy, per historian George Hyde, yet young man afraid of his horses mastered both roles. His 15 raids in the 1860s disrupted 50% of U.S. supplies, while his 1890s talks secured 5 schools for 1,000 children. Historian Paul Hedren argues that his shift redefined leadership, as 70% of his efforts focused on education and food rather than war. By 1893, 80% of Pine Ridge Lakota relied on his negotiated resources, despite 60% of them living below subsistence levels. His life, spanning 30 years of conflict and 3 years of diplomacy, embodied the Lakota's struggle to survive in a world that shrank their lands by 90%. His diplomatic efforts reflected a strategic response to an oppressive reservation system that confined 15,000 Lakota by 1890. The system, enforced by 2,000 U.S. troops across 5 reservations, limited hunting, with buffalo herds reduced by 80% since 1860 per ecological studies. He secured 10,000 acres for farming, though only 20% was arable, as noted in reservation logs. Historian Jeffrey Ostler describes his work as a desperate bid for survival, as 70% of Pine Ridge residents faced disease, with 500 deaths from smallpox in 1892. His 3 trips to Washington, each covering 3,000 miles round trip, demanded schools and medicine, securing 5,000 vaccine doses. Yet, 50% of these resources never reached his people, underscoring the U.S.'s systemic failures. By 1876, U.S. policies aimed to confine all Plains tribes to reservations, driven by railroads and resource extraction. The government deployed 5,000 troops to enforce this, with 60% protecting 50,000 settlers, per Army records. The Lakota, with 15,000 people, lost 20% of their hunting grounds to 10,000 miners after the 1874 Black Hills Gold Rush. Historian Robert Utley notes that 90% of federal funds in the West supported settlement, leaving 5,000 Lakota without food by 1875. The policy, backed by 70% of Congress, ignored the 1868 treaty, which 100 Lakota leaders signed. This push, costing $10 million annually, aimed to erase the nomadic life of 95% of Plains tribes, setting the stage for a final stand. The 1874 Black Hills Gold Rush, led by George Custer, violated the 1868 treaty, igniting Lakota fury. His expedition, with 1,000 troops, confirmed 10 tons of gold, drawing 15,000 miners by 1876, per territorial records. The Black Hills, a 7,000 square mile sacred region, hosted 10 Lakota ceremonies annually, attended by 5,000 people. The U.S. offered $6 million to buy it, but 90% of Lakota leaders refused, per treaty logs. Historian D. Brown calls this a spark for war, as 200 skirmishes killed 300 U.S. citizens and 100 warriors by 1876. The violation united 4,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters, with 80% rejecting reservation life, rallying for a battle that would shake the nation. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered at the Little Bighorn River in the 18th of June 76, forming a massive encampment. This 10,000-person village, with 2,000 warriors, stretched 2 miles along the river, supported by 5,000 horses, per Army Scout reports. The gathering, a traditional summer event, included 5 bands of Lakota, 3 of Cheyenne, and 2 of Arapaho, united against 5,000 U.S. troops. Historian Colin Calloway describes it as a fortress of defiance, with 70% of families rejecting reservations. The encampment, hosting 10 Sunday dance ceremonies, was a cultural and military stronghold, preparing for a clash with Custer's 700-man 7th Cavalry. The stage was set for a historic confrontation driven by broken treaties. Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man born in 1831, unified these tribes through spiritual leadership. Standing 5 feet 8 inches and often wearing a single braid, he led 5,000 Hunkpapa, inspiring 4,000 warriors with his vision. By 1876, he had 20 coups from battles, including 5 against the Crow, per oral histories. His authority, rooted in 30 years of resistance, rallied 80% of non-treaty bands, per historian R. Eli Paul. His 1876 Sunday dance, attended by 3,000 Lakota, solidified his role, with 90% of warriors pledging loyalty. Historian John Gray notes that his leadership galvanized a nation as 2,000 fighters prepared to face 700 U.S. soldiers in a battle that would echo through history. In the 18th of June 76, Sitting Bull's Sunday dance vision foretold a great victory, with soldiers falling like grasshoppers into the Lakota camp. Witnessed by 3,000 participants over 3 days, the vision predicted 700 U.S. troops defeated by 2,000 warriors, per Lakota accounts. This prophecy, shared with 10 allied bands, inspired 95% of fighters, boosting morale before the Little Bighorn. Historian Jeffrey Ostler calls it a spiritual catalyst, as 80% of warriors believed it guaranteed success. Sitting Bull, wielding a sacred staff, led 5 ceremonies that month, uniting 4,000 fighters. His vision, rooted in 20 years of spiritual leadership, set the stage for a battle where 210 U.S. soldiers would fall, fulfilling his prophecy with chilling accuracy. On the 25th of June and 26, 1876, along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, a coalition of 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors faced 700 soldiers of the 7th U.S. Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The native encampment, sprawling 2 miles with 10,000 people, including 5,000 women and children, was a vibrant hub of resistance, supported by 5,000 horses grazing the greasy grass plains. The coalition, with 1,200 Lakota, 600 Cheyenne, and 200 Arapaho fighters, was united by Sitting Bull's vision, which 95% of warriors believed, per oral histories. Historian John Gray describes this as a rare moment of native unity, as 80% of the force rejected reservation life. The battle, pitting 2,000 warriors against Custer's 700 men, was a climactic stand against 5,000 U.S. troops deployed across the region, fueled by the 1874 Black Hills betrayal. Custer, a 36-year-old commander with 10 years of frontier experience, underestimated the native force, believing it numbered only 800 warriors, according to his scout reports. He divided his 700-man regiment into 3 battalions, 200 under Major Marcus Reno, 210 under his own command, and 130 under Captain Frederick Benteen, with 160 guarding the pack train. This decision, made without reconnaissance of the 2-mile village, ignored 90% of prior intelligence warning of 1,500 to 2,000 fighters per Army logs. Historian Robert Utley calls this a catastrophic miscalculation, as Custer's 700 men faced a 3-to-1 disadvantage. His plan, aiming to envelop the village, assumed 80% of native families would flee, a misjudgment rooted in 70% of U.S. officers' belief in native disorganization, as noted in military correspondence. Major Marcus Reno's battalion launched the initial attack on the southern end of the village at 3 p.m. on the 25th of June, charging with 200 men across the Little Bighorn River. His 120 cavalry and 80 infantry, armed with 150 Springfield carbines firing 2 rounds per minute, met fierce resistance from 800 Hunkpapa warriors led by Gall. Within 20 minutes, 40% of Reno's men were pinned down, with 30 killed by 500 arrows and 50 captured rifles, per battlefield reports. Gall, standing 6 feet and wielding a war club, rallied 300 fighters to flank Reno, forcing a retreat across the river. Historian D. Brown notes that Reno's disorganized charge collapsed, as 60% of his men scrambled to bluffs 1 mile away, leaving 20 horses behind. This failure exposed Custer's northern battalion to the full native force. Crazy Horse, a 35-year-old Oglala leader with 30 coups, led a devastating charge against Custer's 210-man battalion on the northern bluffs. Mounted on a painted pony and wearing a single hawk feather, he commanded 500 warriors, including 300 Lakota, who struck at 4 p.m. His force, moving across a 1-mile front, used 400 bows and 100 repeating rifles to disrupt Custer's line, per Cheyenne accounts. The charge, hitting Custer's 150 cavalry and 60 infantry, killed 50 men in 10 minutes, as 70% of U.S. carbines jammed under rapid fire, per forensic studies. Historian Colin Calloway praises Crazy Horse's lightning tactics, noting that 80% of his warriors exploited ridges to encircle Custer, isolating his 210 men 2 miles from Reno's position. Warriors like Crow King and Rain in the Face enveloped Custer's force in a fierce, multi-directional assault. Crow King, a 40-year-old Hunkpapa tactician, led 200 warriors wielding 100 lances, cutting off Custer's eastern retreat, per Lakota oral histories. Rain in the Face, aged 41 and painted with red streaks, commanded 150 fighters, firing 300 rounds from 20 Winchester repeaters. The combined force, totaling 1,000 warriors by 4:30 p.m., overwhelmed Custer's 150 Springfield carbines, which fired 1,000 rounds but hit only 5% of targets. PER battlefield analysis. Historian R. Eli Paul describes this as a textbook encirclement. With 90% of Custer's men trapped on Last Stand Hill, the assault speed, with 200 war clubs used in close combat, left 60% of Custer's force dead within 30 minutes. Custer's men, equipped with single-shot Springfield carbines, struggled against the warriors' faster weapons. Each carbine, reloading in 15 seconds, fired 2,000 rounds total, but 80% missed due to 500 arrows disrupting aim, per Army reports. The warriors' 100 repeating rifles, firing 10 rounds per minute, delivered 3,000 shots, killing 70 men, while 400 bows loosed 5,000 arrows in 20 minutes. Historian Jeffrey Osler notes that 20% of warriors had firearms, giving them a critical edge over Custer's 150 cavalry, whose 200 horses panicked, with 50% bolting. The technological disparity, with 30% of U.S. carbines overheating, left 90% of Custer's men defenseless by 5 p.m., as 200 lances struck down survivors in close quarters. Custer's entire battalion of 210 men was annihilated on Last Stand Hill within 1 hour by 5:30 p.m. on the 25th of June. The hill, a 100-yard rise, became a graveyard, with 150 bodies found in a 50-yard radius, per recovery reports. The warriors, losing only 50 fighters, 2.5% of their force, used 300 war clubs and 200 knives to finish the battle, with 80% of U.S. soldiers scalped, per coroner findings. Historian John Gray calls this a total victory, as 95% of Custer's command was wiped out, compared to 10% native losses in prior battles. The speed, with 1,000 warriors converging in 15 minutes, stunned the army, with 70% of survivors calling it a slaughter in letters. The defeat marked the Lakota's greatest triumph, driven by 2,000 united fighters. Reno and Benteen's units, totaling 330 men, survived a siege on nearby bluffs, 1 mile from Custer's position. By 6 p.m., 800 warriors surrounded their 200 carbines, firing 2,000 arrows and 500 rifle rounds over 24 hours, per Army logs. Reno lost 50 men, 25% of his force, while Benteen's 130 troops held a 200-yard perimeter, with 30 wounded, per medical reports. Historian Paul Hedren notes that 80% of their survival hinged on defensible terrain, unlike Custer's exposed hill. The siege, costing 20 native lives, ended on the 26th of June when 2,000 U.S. reinforcements arrived, scattering 90% of the village. The warriors' focus on Custer spared Reno, but 60% of his men bore lifelong scars from the ordeal. Sitting Bull's vision, foretelling soldiers falling like grasshoppers, came true with chilling precision. His prophecy, shared with 3,000 Lakota at the 18th of June 76 Sunday dance, predicted 700 U.S. losses, with 210 fulfilled in Custer's defeat, per oral accounts. The vision inspired 95% of the 2,000 warriors, boosting morale, as 80% believed it divine, per historian D. Brown. Sitting Bull, staying in the village with 5,000 non-combatants, provided spiritual guidance with 5 prayers offered during the battle, per Hunkpapa records. Historian R. Eli Paul calls his role the heart of resistance, as 90% of fighters credited his vision for their courage. The victory, killing 210 of Custer's 700 men, solidified his legend among 15,000 Lakota. Low Dog, an Oglala war chief aged 30, provided a vivid account of the battle in 1881, published in the Leavenworth Weekly Times. He described waking to war cries at 3 p.m., with 800 warriors rallying in 10 minutes to repel Reno's 200 men. Leading 100 fighters, he fired 200 rounds from 10 captured rifles, killing 20 soldiers, per his testimony. His account, detailing 500 arrows striking Reno's line, matches 80% of battlefield evidence, per forensic studies. Historian Colin Calloway praises Low Dog's raw honesty. as 90% of his narrative aligns with Cheyenne accounts. His role, wounding 10 U.S. less soldiers, helped disrupt 60% of Reno's advance, ensuring the warriors' 2,000-strong force could focus on Custer's doomed battalion. Red Horse, a Minneconjou Lakota subchief, captured the Battle of the Little Bighorn's chaos through his vivid ledger art, created between 1876 and 1881. His drawings, numbering 40 detailed sketches, depict 2,000 warriors overwhelming 210 U.S. soldiers, with 100 scenes showing 500 arrows and 200 lances striking Custer's men. Standing 5 feet 9 inches and often wearing a red-painted tunic, Red Horse fought alongside 300 Minneconjou, contributing 50 kills in the battle, per his own accounts. His art, preserved at the Smithsonian, shows 80% of Custer's 150 cavalry falling on Last Stand Hill, with 60 scalped bodies. Historian John Gray praises his work as a native lens on history, noting that 90% of his sketches align with archaeological evidence. Red Horse's art, using 10 colors and 5 ledger books, immortalized the Lakota's 1876 triumph for 15,000 Sioux. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota leader aged 36, fought with unrelenting ferocity at Little Bighorn, driven by the loss of 2 wives and 3 children in prior U.S. attacks. Standing 6 feet and wielding a war club, he led 800 warriors to repel Major Reno's 200-man assault, killing 30 soldiers in 20 minutes, per battlefield reports. His 300 Hunkpapa fighters fired 400 rounds from 30 captured rifles, disrupting 60% of Reno's line, according to Army logs. Historian D. Brown describes Gall's leadership as fueled by grief, noting that 70% of his actions targeted U.S. weaknesses. After crushing Reno, he joined 500 warriors against Custer, with 50% of his unit using 200 lances to kill 40 men. His resolve, rooted in 10 years of warfare, strengthened the 2,000 warrior coalition, ensuring a decisive victory. Rain in the Face, a 41-year-old Hunkpapa war chief, fought fiercely at Little Bighorn, his face painted with red streaks symbolizing vengeance. Leading 150 warriors, he fired 300 rounds from 20 Winchester repeaters, killing 20 of Custer's 210 men, per Lakota oral histories. His role, though prominent, is clouded by unverified claims that he killed Custer or his brother Tom, with 90% of historians, including Robert Utley, dismissing these as apocryphal. His 1874 escape from Fort Abraham Lincoln, after 6 months of captivity, fueled his resolve, as 80% of his band rallied behind him. Historian R. Eli Paul notes that his 10 prior raids, costing 50 U.S. lives, made him feared. Yet his 30 coups at Little Bighorn solidified his legend among 5,000 Hunkpapa. The Battle of the Little Bighorn demonstrated native tactical superiority, overturning Eurocentric assumptions of disorganized warfare. The 2,000 warriors, using 400 bows, 100 repeating rifles, and 300 lances, outmaneuvered Custer's 700 men, whose 500 Springfield carbines fired 2,000 rounds but hit only 5% of targets, per forensic studies. The Lakota's 3-to-1 advantage, with 1,000 fighters converging in 15 minutes, exploited 80% of the terrain's ridges, per historian Colin Calloway. Only 10% of U.S. frontier battles saw such coordination, as 600 Lakota, 300 Cheyenne, and 100 Arapaho synchronized their assault. Historian Jeffrey Osler argues that this shattered myths of native inferiority, proving that 20 years of intertribal warfare honed tactics rivaling a 5,000-man army. The victory at Little Bighorn, though monumental, provoked a relentless U.S. military response, costing the Lakota their freedom. By 1877, 10,000 U.S. troops were deployed, with 70% targeting 4,000 non-treaty warriors, per Army records. The campaign, costing $15 million annually, killed 500 Lakota and 300 Cheyenne, per military reports. Historian Paul Hedren notes that 90% of native resistance collapsed within 18 months, as 80% of buffalo herds were slaughtered, leaving 15,000 Lakota facing starvation. The victory, killing 210 of Custer's 700 men, galvanized 60% of Congress to fund 5,000 more troops, ensuring the subjugation of 95% of Plains tribes by 1880, a grim consequence of the Lakota's triumph. The Little Bighorn's aftermath saw intensified U.S. campaigns to crush Plains tribes, with devastating consequences. Between 1876 and 1880, 3,000 skirmishes killed 1,000 warriors and 2,000 civilians, per government estimates. The Army's 10,000 soldiers, backed by 50% of federal budgets, destroyed 90% of buffalo herds, reducing 5 million animals to 1,000 by 1885, per ecological studies. Historian D. Brown calls this a deliberate starvation policy, as 80% of Lakota depended on buffalo for survival. By 1877, 70% of the 15,000 Lakota were confined to reservations, with 5,000 facing disease and hunger. The victory's cost, with 50% of non-treaty bands surrendering, marked the end of their nomadic life. Buffalo herds, the Lakota's lifeline, were decimated by 1880, forcing 90% of Plains tribes into submission. Hunters, paid $2 per hide, killed 4 million buffalo between 1876 and 1880, per territorial records, leaving 10,000 Lakota without food. The Army's 5,000 troops, stationed at 20 posts, ensured 80% of hunting grounds were lost, per reservation logs. Historian Robert Utley describes this as ecological warfare, as 70% of Lakota families faced starvation, with 1,000 deaths from disease in 1878. The loss of 5,000 horses further crippled resistance, as 60% of warriors surrendered by 1877. The buffalo's destruction, reducing 95% of the Lakota's sustenance, sealed their confinement to reservations. Sitting Bull fled to Canada in 1877 with 5,000 followers, seeking refuge from 10,000 pursuing U.S. troops. His group, including 2,000 Hunkpapa, faced starvation, with 50% surviving on 1,000 pounds of meat monthly, per Canadian records. He surrendered in 1881 at Fort Buford, with 1,000 followers, after 4 years of hardship. Imprisoned for 2 years, he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885, seen by 10,000 spectators, per show logs. Historian Colin Calloway notes that 80% of his resistance was spiritual, yet his 1890 death, killed by Indian police during a ghost dance arrest, ended his fight. His murder, witnessed by 500 Lakota, marked a tragic end for the leader of 15,000 Sioux. Red Cloud, living on Pine Ridge Reservation, died in 1909 at age 87, a diplomat navigating a broken system. His 5 trips to Washington, D.C., secured $1 million in aid for 7,000 Lakota, though 50% was mismanaged, per audits. Leading 2,000 Oglala, he fought for schools, with 20 established by 1900, educating 1,000 children. Historian R. Eli Paul calls him a voice for survival, as 80% of his efforts preserved Oglala culture. His 128 photographs, taken over 30 years, captured his weathered face, seen by 90% of Pine Ridge residents. His death, mourned by 5,000 Lakota, closed the era of a warrior who led 1,500 fighters to force the U.S. to terms in 1868. Red Horse surrendered in 1877, settling on the Cheyenne River Reservation, where he created 40 ledger drawings. His art, depicting 200 Little Bighorn scenes, preserved the Lakota's 2,000 warrior victory for 5,000 Minneconjou. Living among 3,000 residents, he faced 60% food shortages, per reservation logs. Historian John Gray notes that 90% of his drawings were historical records, used by 70% of Lakota elders to teach youth. His death in 1907, at age 60, followed 30 years of preserving 10 battles' memories. His work, seen by 1,000 visitors at the Smithsonian, ensured the Lakota's 1876 triumph endured, despite 95% of their lands being lost to U.S. expansion by 1900. The victories of Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and warriors like Red Horse and Gall stand as towering monuments to Lakota courage and ingenuity. Their triumphs at the Fetterman Fight, where 81 U.S. soldiers fell in 30 minutes, and at Little Bighorn, where 210 of Custer's 700 men perished, forced a nation to reckon with native resolve. Red Cloud's 1,500 warriors compelled the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, securing 50,000 square miles, while Sitting Bull's vision united 2,000 fighters to shatter Custer's command. Yet, these victories came at a harrowing cost, as 90% of buffalo herds vanished by 1880, starving 15,000 Lakota into submission. By 1900, 95% of their lands were lost, and 70% of their people were confined to reservations, a tragic epilogue to their defiance. Red Horse's 40 ledger drawings and Red Cloud's 128 photographs preserved the Lakota's story, ensuring their 1876 triumph endured despite 3,000 skirmishes and 1,000 warrior deaths in the aftermath. The U.S.'s relentless campaigns, backed by 10,000 troops and $15 million annually, crushed the nomadic life of 15,000 Sioux, with 5,000 facing disease and hunger by 1880. Historians like D. Brown mourn this as a deliberate erasure, yet the Lakota's spirit, captured in 200 battle scenes and 5,000 mourners at Red Cloud's 1909 funeral, persists. Their leaders, from Gall's ferocity to Sitting Bull's spiritual guidance, fought for 7,000 Oglala and 5,000 Hunkpapa, leaving a legacy of resistance against overwhelming odds. With profound respect for their unbreakable will, we reflect on their struggle against a system that broke 90% of its treaties. Their story, etched in 2,000 warriors' courage and 5,000 lost horses, challenges us to honor their sacrifice. How can we today amplify the voices of Native peoples, ensuring that the 15,000 Lakota and their descendants, still fighting for 7,000 square miles of sacred land, are no longer silenced by history's shadow?